So I had a thought today, as usual, inspired by a discussion that I was having online, about how to even quantify what makes a good RPG. The discussion specifically was talking about, like, is there such a thing as a perfect RPG? And I don't think that there is. I would posit that there is not only no such thing, that the term doesn't even really mean anything, if you get right down to it. There's no such thing as a perfect RPG, and there cannot be. It's kind of like trying to approach the speed of light. You can get closer and closer and closer, but you can always get closer. You will never reach it. It's like infinity. You can't get there. You can just get arbitrarily large. So then I got to thinking, like, what makes an RPG good? Like, what are the factors that go into this approaching perfection that can never be achieved? Like, if perfection doesn't exist, how do we define improvement? Because usually you would think of improvement as moving towards perfection. And if there is no such thing, then how does one improve? How does one make a good game? So I want to go through this in real time as I'm thinking about it. There is, I think, at least 2, maybe 3 axes on which quality of game can be measured. The first of which is how well does the game facilitate or how well does it reflect the vision of the creator? So when you're making a game, you have a particular gameplay experience in mind that you want to create, probably. You have design goals. And how well does the game meet those design goals? Basically is what that comes down to. A lot of designers have experiences in mind. So they say, "Oh, I want this to feel, action-packed, fast-paced. I want it to have, you feel like big heroes, like really cool characters. I'm going to design a game that does that." And if that is the experience that the players then get, then that part of the game is doing well. And this will, of course, vary from individual to individual. Because as with all art, it is translated through the eyes of the beholder. And not everyone is going to experience the game in the same way. Which is part of why there can never be perfection on any of these qualities. But there can be a sort of general sense of how well the game performs. So I would argue that Blades in the Dark does very, very good at this. Blades in the Dark as a system very well reflects the fantasy that the designer had in mind. And any kind of system that is purpose-built for a particular setting is going to do really well at this. That's an overgeneralization. They're going to do better than a system that is for like a generic settings, system or setting agnostic systems, generic systems like D&D. It has a default setting, but it isn't purpose built for that setting. Genesis is it has setting books that sort of push it in the direction of certain settings, but it's not really designed for any particular setting, and so it's always going to have a certain element of mismatch. Legend of the Five Rings, on the other hand, it's kind of a hybrid of these two, because it is clearly spawned from the Genesis system. Like it clearly has a lot of DNA in there from Genesis, but it has a lot of systems and mechanics that are explicitly meant to evoke the setting that the game is written for, and so it's going to do really well at that. Is going to do a good job of evoking the kind of experience that the designer wants the players to have. So that's axis number 1. Axis number 2 is how well does it facilitate the experience that the players want or expect. And I'm going to go ahead and lump in want and expect into a single thing. Because presumably, if you are looking at a game and you know the description of the game, you have an idea of the premise, and you say, let's play this game, you want what you expect the game to do. So I'm going to assume that those are more or less the same thing. Now, this really just comes down to like quality of system engineering. This is probably the hardest part about game design, is getting the game to actually do what the players want and expect it to do. For example, D&D 5e is ever present on our minds. You might expect or want to play a powerful martial character, like, say, this cunning rogue, and you're gonna sneak up in, backstab for massive damage, and then zoom out of there. You're a hit and run skirmisher. It does I was about to say DPS, DPR. You're gonna do high damage and sort of like zoom in and out, back and forth. You're constantly hiding. And your main contribution is that you do the most damage in the party because you are a high damage, low durability character. And then, also you have a lot of skills, and you're going to be able to basically carry the party in non-combat situations with your skills because you're very good at skills. Well, how well does the game actually facilitate that fantasy? Not well. Because rogues are actually one of the lowest damage characters. I can't remember if they beat out the monk. Their ceiling, I'm pretty sure, is the lowest of all the characters, of all the character classes. Maybe with the exception of the artificer. No, the artificer's going to be way higher. Artificer's way higher. And their skirmishing abilities are not that great, because they don't generally have enough movement to get in and out while also spending one of their cunning action bonuses to disengage. So they either have to take opportunity attacks getting in and out, or not move far enough away so that the enemies can't get to them. And yeah, you can supplement this with feats, but it's like a lot of investment for what should really be part of the rogue's primary package. And then they are squishy, and they also scale very poorly. So then the skills are of questionable use. It's kind of DM fiat. You kind of have to get the DM on board with letting you do things that the rules don't actually say that you can do. And you aren't actually better at skills than other classes. Bards pretty much do everything rogues can do and more, and spells mostly invalidate the need for skills for the most part. So that's an example of the game does not deliver on the fantasy that players expect. Now, what's going to happen sometimes, and what muddies these waters, is when the players expect a certain experience so much that it doesn't matter if the experience actually happens. They will assume they've done something wrong. They will assume that, the circumstances just haven't come up yet. Or they will only remember when things line up and go perfectly. That time that you crit 3 times in a single fight. The rogue because rogue crits, sure, yeah, they do a lot of damage because they have a lot of extra dice. So rogue crits are pretty decent. But, how often does that come up? In my experience, less than once a session, usually. Depending on, I guess it depends on how long your sessions are. You only get 1 attack per round, generally. Maybe 2 if you're doing well. And you have a 5% chance to crit. I built a rogue meant to crit once. It was because I dipped 3 levels into fighter for the champion ability to crit on 19 to 20. Please don't hate me. Don't think less of me for doing this. It was a funny idea. Because I thought I'm big brain guy here. If I have a lot of dice from sneak attack and an expanded crit range, that means that I'm going to crit a lot. Not really. That build actually did decent damage compared to the rest of the party. That's kind of a low optimization party anyways. So what I'm getting at here is that sometimes, due to player psychology, you will not remember or not recognize how poorly a game suits the fantasy. Which is a really weird thing to happen. And I don't have any kind of educational background in psychology, but I feel like a study could be done on this, about players sort of forgiving the game that they are playing for not delivering, and then sort of retroactively assuming that it does deliver on the fantasy that it clearly does not. So there's how well does it reflect the experience or the intended experience of the designer, and how well does it facilitate the expectations and fantasies of the player? So those are the two main axes, and I want to say there was a third. What was the third? So there's this sort of like quasi third dimension, this third parallel axis for evaluating the overall quality of an RPG, which is how fun it ends up being, which is separate from the second point, because although you may expect a certain experience, that experience may not end up being fun in a general sense. If there was an RPG about being victims of horrific events, like that could be interesting psychologically, but it's not going to have general appeal. That's a tricky situation that's going to be not for general audiences for multiple reasons. And so that is sort of an element, like it's not a huge thing. I would call that dimension smaller than the other two. Because as a general thing, you don't make games like that. As a general thing, they are out there. I don't even want to get into examples of that because, like, who wants to think about that shit? So I would say that those are the two main axes that are responsible for the overall quality of an RPG. And if it does well at both of those, we can confidently say that that's a good game. Even if it is a game that you don't prefer. So I recognize that Pathfinder 2nd Edition is a good game, generally. I don't prefer it. It's not my style. It is not the experience that I want. So that's when the separation between what the player wants and what they expect actually happens. That's where it breaks down. That's just a matter of preference, though. I can recognize that Pathfinder 2 is a good game, even though it is not for me. It is not my genre of fantasy. And so there is this distinction between the quality of the game and whether or not the game speaks to you directly as a player. And this is why I've always been such a fan of 4th edition, because 4th edition D&D speaks to me. It approaches fantasy, storytelling, and RPGs in a way that resonates with me as an individual. Like, the way that I think about stories is the way that 4th edition thinks about stories. It is so easy to adapt. Like there's mechanics in it that don't jive with the way that I think fantasy should work, such as magic. I don't really like the expending spell slots or, daily abilities or encounter abilities. The way I envision magic is always going to be, you have like a reserve of inner strength that you spend on magical effects. And you sort of have a general purpose understanding of the type of magic that you're using. So, like, for example, you don't have to learn individual illusion spells. You just know how to make illusions. And then you sort of craft those on the fly. And your skill as a caster is how well you can craft them and how believable they end up being. That kind of thing. But that's really hard to translate into an RPG in a general sense, unless the RPG is expressly about its magic system. Kids on Brooms, Ars Magica, these kinds of systems do this stuff. It's not for a general purpose RPG like D&D. So, but like the heroic fantasy that 4th edition sets up is very easy to translate into, this is the other way around. My ideas for how fantasy stories are set up is very easy to translate into 4th edition because of the way that it approaches heroic fantasy. So, how much you like a system is definitely separate from how good that system is. And you can absolutely have pet systems that I like this system, though I recognize that it's not great. That kind of thing. yeah, there is a separation between preference and overall quality, but I think being able to quantify the quality of an RPG is helpful in discussing them as an industry. And so it's probably going to be on one of those two axes that I criticize or praise any given RPG. Either it is doing a particularly good or bad job of meeting the designer's intent, or a particularly good or bad job of fulfilling player fantasy. And they can, some sort of cross section of those two is how you land at whether a game is overall good or overall bad. But it is impossible for both of those, or either of those, honestly, to be perfect. Specifically because every player, every table is a bit different. They run differently. And someone just pulled up and is playing music right next to me. And so I've lost my train of thought, and it seems like a good time to end the video. So yeah, those are my thoughts on that particular topic. Bye.